A girl left school and headed home, but she never made it. As soon as police began their investigation, they were faced with a long list of suspects, each with their own dark and unsettling story. Yet despite their efforts, detectives struggled to solve this case. 4 years, this went on until a series of seemingly random events led to a shocking truth, one that would shake the entire town. Tina Faelz was born on April 27, 1969, in Washington state. When she was little, her parents decided to split up, and she moved to California with her mom, settling in a small town called Pleasanton. Not long after, her mom married a man named Steve, and they had a son together. Tina, who was only 6 at the time, was thrilled to help take care of her baby brother. Despite her age, her parents often trusted her to babysit him. Tina grew up to be very independent, and she started planning her future from an early age. By the time she was in middle school, she was already thinking about which college she wanted to attend and had even started saving up to buy her own car. In 1984, when Tina was 14 and in her freshman year of high school, she wasn't exactly thrilled about the place. She was pretty shy and quiet, sticking to her small circle of friends. Because of that, other girls at school started picking on her, and Tina even thought about transferring schools at the end of the year. On April 5th, her day started off rough. When she walked into the cafeteria, a group of girls started bullying her again, even threatening to wait for her after school. The school had a pretty bad reputation, and Tina only ended up there because it was the closest to her house. For example, that same day, another incident happened. A few boys shoved a classmate into an outdoor trash bin, and when a teacher found him, they realized he was heavily drunk. It turned out that some students had brought alcohol to school and were drinking it during class. Tina's mom had offered to transfer her to a different school, but Tina wanted to wait it out until the end of the year, which was just a few months away. That day, on top of dealing with her classmates' bullying, Tina was also told to stay after school as punishment for being late to her classes so often. Tina used to take the school bus, but she had to stop because of those girls who would bully her the entire ride. After that, her mom started driving her, but since her mom also had to get ready for work in the mornings, Tina ended up running late a lot. Still, the school decided to punish her anyway. But Tina wasn't having it. She decided to skip detention and just head straight home. Even though her house wasn't far, the route wasn't exactly straightforward. First, she had to walk along a narrow path that led to an underpass beneath the highway, then continue a few hundred yards more before she'd finally reach her house. Tina left school around 2:50 p.m. and started walking home. At first, there were other kids on the path, but they all eventually went their separate ways, leaving her alone. About 20 minutes later, a truck driver was passing by on the highway above the underpass when he noticed what looked like a person lying on the ground near the entrance to the tunnel. It struck him as odd, so he decided to turn around at the nearest exit and pull over to get a closer look. When he drove back over the underpass, he realized it was a body lying there and immediately went to find the nearest pay phone to call the police. On his way, he spotted a police car and flagged down the officers to tell them what he'd seen. Around the same time, the police also received a call from other students who had been walking along the path and stumbled across the body. The officers rushed to the scene and found the body of a young girl. From the amount of blood, it was clear she had been stabbed multiple times. They quickly secured the area and began their investigation. The first thing they noticed was her bag hanging from a tree a few yards away from the body. When they retrieved it, they were able to identify the victim. It was Tina. The crime scene examination didn't yield much. The police collected a bunch of items scattered around, like cigarette butts, but it seemed unlikely they were connected to the crime. The murder weapon was nowhere to be found either. After detectives broke the news to Tina's mom, they showed her Tina's bag and established that none of her personal belongings were missing, so it didn't seem like a robbery. Investigators were left hoping that the medical examiners and forensic experts could turn up some clues, but even they came up short. The only thing they could confirm was that the victim had been stabbed 44 times with what looked like a kitchen knife. There was no evidence of sexual assault, which ruled out another potential motive. All of this led detectives to believe that the crime was most likely committed by someone who knew Tina and harbored a deep hatred for her. Tina's mom told them about the girls who had been bullying her at school, and the police started looking into each of them. But it turned out that the entire group had also been given detention that day and stayed after school, which was backed up by a teacher's testimony. Soon, the police got another interesting lead. A high school student came forward and said that after school, while driving along the highway near where Tina's body was found, he spotted his classmate Jeff running toward the tunnel. Investigators quickly learned that Jeff was a troubled teen. He was known as one of the school's main bullies and regularly picked on other students. On top of that, several girls had accused him of inappropriate actions toward them. But what really raised red flags for the detectives was the fact that Jeff was known to carry a pocket knife with him all the time. The police went to question him and immediately noticed a fresh cut on his finger. Jeff claimed he'd cut himself at work while slicing pizza, but later he changed his story and said he got the cut while removing a vent cover. This was enough for the police to get a warrant to search his house. Inside, they found 2 hunting knives. Officers sent them off to the lab for testing, but no traces of blood were found on either one. Jeff also denied any involvement in Tina's murder, and without solid evidence, the police didn't have enough to arrest him. The main problem was that they didn't have a single piece of solid evidence. The crime scene yielded nothing that could be tied to the killer. No fingerprints, no personal items, nothing. There were also no biological traces left behind that could later be used for DNA analysis as technology advanced. In the end, Jeff remained on the list of suspects, but the investigators had no choice but to keep searching for any other leads that might break the case open. The police received a flood of tips, but every one of them led to a dead end. Students at the school pointed fingers at their classmates, and some even confessed to friends that they were the ones who committed the crime. However, when detectives brought them in for questioning, they all claimed it was just a bad joke and that they had nothing to do with the murder. Soon, investigators turned their attention to Tina's stepdad. They learned that he and Tina's mom had recently split up because he had started drinking heavily and acting aggressively. What's more, relatives and friends of Tina's mom told detectives that he had been physically abusive toward her, though the woman herself denied it. Despite their recent breakup, the man had been trying to reconcile. Just a few days before the murder, he had shown up at their house. Things escalated into another argument, and Tina had yelled at him to leave her mom alone. When detectives questioned him, the man claimed he'd been at work when the murder happened. His co-workers backed up his story. But then, the detectives uncovered something fishy. After hearing about Tina's death, the man had taken a bus driven by an acquaintance to Tina's mom's house. The driver later told police that, right before getting off, the man handed him a knife and asked him to hold onto it for a while. The police found this super suspicious, but the man insisted he just didn't think it was appropriate to show up at Tina's mom's house with a knife after her daughter had been killed with one. Detectives looked into his possible involvement a bit longer, but his alibi held up. So eventually, they had to cross him off the suspect list. There was no progress in the case until 5 days later when police suddenly got a new suspect. A young woman from a town called Felton, about 50 miles from Pleasanton, was walking through an underpass when she was attacked by a stranger. The man demanded she do whatever he said, threatening to kill her, but she managed to break free and run away, immediately reporting the attack to the police. Detectives on Tina's case immediately noticed that this attack bore a chilling resemblance to her murder. Eventually, they tracked down and arrested the attacker, a 23-year-old man named Walter. Digging into his past, investigators discovered Walter had been living in Pleasanton at the time of Tina's murder and moved away right after it happened. They also learned that, on the day Tina was killed, Walter had visited his grandmother and acted strangely. He was visibly upset, telling her he didn't like where his life was going. After his arrest in Felton, police got a warrant to search Walter's home. Inside, they found blood-stained clothes and 2 knives also covered in blood. But when the evidence went to the lab, there was a twist. The blood came from animals, not humans. Detectives kept pushing to tie Walter to Tina's murder, but nothing stuck. They eventually moved on to other leads, though Walter remained a person of interest in the case. Over the next few weeks, police began to wonder if Tina's murder might be the work of an unknown serial killer. In the months that followed, 3 more young women were killed in and around Pleasanton, but investigators made little progress on any of the cases. Still, they started to suspect the crimes might be connected. The theory plunged the town, once considered safe, into fear. Women avoided walking alone, and parents kept their children under tight supervision. Pressure mounted on the police department as the public demanded answers, but detectives hit dead ends every time. Years passed with no breakthroughs in Tina's case. Then, in 1989, another young woman was murdered in Pleasanton, just a few miles from where Tina's body had been found, also near an underpass. But like all the others, this case went cold, leaving investigators no closer to catching the killer. The next twist in the case came in 1994. By then, DNA analysis had become a powerful tool in forensics, and detectives finally cracked one of the cold cases linked to the suspected serial killer. Experts re-examined evidence and got a DNA match to 35-year-old Michael I.D., who was already serving time for murdering a 66-year-old woman. With the DNA hit, Michael became a suspect in 3 other killings, including Tina's. But here's where things get interesting. When detectives told Tina's mom about him, she suddenly claimed she recognized him. Looking at his photo, she said she'd seen him at a barbecue years before the murder. She even dug up old photos from the event to prove it. But when she found them, she realized she was wrong. The man in the photo looked eerily similar to Michael, but it wasn't him. Investigators spent years digging for any link between Michael and Tina's murder, but they came up empty. He couldn't be tied to 2 of the other killings either. Still, he was sentenced to death for the one murder where his DNA sealed his fate. 2 years later, in 1996, detectives cracked another case when DNA matched a man named Robert Rhodes. But just like with the previous suspect, police couldn't tie him to Tina's murder. Over the next decade, a few more suspects popped up, but they all denied any involvement, and the case stalled out again. Then, in 2007, Detective Dana Savage decided to take a fresh look. She was pregnant at the time and couldn't handle her usual duties, so she started digging into cold cases instead, and Tina's file caught her eye. After combing through every shred of evidence, Savage realized there was nothing solid to point to a killer. But one odd detail stuck with her: Tina's bag hanging in that tree. She knew there was no way Tina could have thrown it up there herself during the attack. This meant the killer had to have done it. By 2007, DNA technology had advanced enough that Savage decided to take a bold step. She sent the bag to the lab, thinking that the killer might have cut himself with his own knife during the frenzied attack, especially since Tina had been stabbed 44 times. If he was bleeding, even a tiny drop could have ended up on the bag when he tossed it into the tree. But their local lab didn't have the tools to detect such old and tiny traces of blood, so the bag was shipped off to the FBI's lab, where it sat waiting for years. This went on until March 2011, when Savage finally got the call she'd been hoping for. FBI experts told her they'd found microscopic traces of blood on the bag and extracted a DNA profile from it. But that wasn't all. When they ran it through the database, it came back as a match. The blood belonged to Stephen Carlson. Detective Savage was shocked to hear the name. She'd been convinced one of 2 other suspects already behind bars was the likely culprit. But Carlson's name wasn't new to her. He had popped up in the case files before. Stephen Carlson had gone to the same school as Tina. He was 16 at the time, and if you remember from earlier, he was the kid who got shoved into the trash bin near the school on the day she was killed. He was also the student who pointed police toward Jeff, the knife-carrying bully we talked about earlier. Detectives had actually considered him a potential suspect during the original investigation, but they had found nothing to back up their suspicions. In school, Stephen's behavior was quite disturbing, and most people wanted nothing to do with him. He had a habit of saying crude and inappropriate things to girls, acted aggressively, and eventually earned the nickname Creepy Carlson because of his odd behavior. He was often bullied by other students. By the time he was around 15, he had started using illegal substances, which only made things worse. He was in and out of juvenile detention multiple times, though never for long. During those years, several people who knew him went to the police, claiming that Stephen had confessed to killing Tina. But whenever officers questioned him, he denied everything, saying it was just a joke. After high school, Carlson ended up in adult prison for 2 years for attempted assault. When he got out, he kept using drugs and refused to register as a sex offender, which led to more arrests. By the end of 2010, Stephen was homeless and got caught with illegal substances. He was arrested, and for the first time, his DNA was collected and entered into the database. That turned out to be crucial because just 6 months later, the FBI lab finally got around to testing Tina's purse. By then, Stephen was already serving time for drug possession, so detectives went to see him. As soon as they mentioned Tina's name, he started acting strangely but still refused to admit anything. With the DNA match, though, detectives had little doubt about his involvement, and he was officially charged with murder. Carlson's lawyer immediately demanded that the case be tried in juvenile court since Stephen was only 16 at the time of the murder, but this request was denied. The trial preparation dragged on for 3 years, and during that time, Stephen remained behind bars. Tragically, on the very day the trial was set to begin, his mother passed away from a heart attack, never getting to see justice for her daughter. As a result, the trial was postponed again and didn't start until October 2014. Despite his lawyer's best efforts to defend him, the jury found Carlson guilty, and he was sentenced to 26 years to life. Even then, he continued to claim he was innocent and immediately filed an appeal. For the next few years, Carlson's appeal was under review, and in 2017, his lawyer finally managed to get the sentence reduced. He convinced the court that the prosecution hadn't proven Stephen intended to kill Tina, meaning he shouldn't have been convicted of first-degree murder. As a result, the charge was lowered to second-degree murder, and his sentence was reduced to 16 years to life. Even then, he still refused to admit his guilt. But in 2020, something completely unexpected happened. Stephen wrote 3 letters, one to Tina's family, one to the police, and one addressed to Tina herself. In those letters, for the first time ever, he took responsibility for what he had done and finally revealed what really happened on that tragic day 36 years earlier. According to his account, Stephen was furious that other students had stuffed him into a trash can earlier that day. On top of that, he had thrown a party at his house the night before, leaving a mess behind, and he knew his father was going to punish him that evening. Frustrated and drunk, he went home right after school, grabbed his knife, and started walking back in the opposite direction. He claimed he had no idea what he was going to do and wasn't planning to attack anyone. But as he stepped out of the underpass, he saw Tina, and without thinking, he brutally attacked her. Carlson claimed he doesn't remember the actual attack. The only thing he recalls is standing over her body, holding a bloody knife. In his letter to Tina and her family, he apologized and admitted that she didn't deserve what happened to her. But despite his confession, many doubted whether he truly felt remorse. See, Stephen's sentence allowed for the possibility of parole, but to get it, he had to convince a board that he regretted his actions and was no longer a threat to society. For convicted killers who keep claiming innocence, getting released is nearly impossible. So it's entirely possible that Carlson wrote those letters just to improve his chances. But even after his confession, his parole request was denied, and he remains behind bars to this day. That said, he'll have plenty more chances to be released, and one day, the board might decide differently. It's also worth mentioning that after Carlson's arrest, many former students from his school spoke out. They said that back then, almost everyone in school suspected him, even though the police had plenty of other, more likely suspects. This only made things worse for Carlson. His classmates avoided him, and most refused to even speak to him. But suspicions didn't help solve the case. In the end, it was modern DNA analysis combined with Detective Savage's determination for justice that finally led to Carlson's arrest. Interestingly, before 2010, his DNA wasn't in the system, so even if investigators had tested the blood on Tina's purse earlier, it probably wouldn't have led to him. It was only because he got caught with illegal substances that his DNA ended up in the database, ultimately sealing his fate. Otherwise, he could have remained free, and Tina's case might have never been solved. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments section, and don't forget to press the like button if you enjoyed my video. Thank you for watching.